Hi, this is Stuart Fensterheim, the Couples Expert, bringing you our 100th episode, our 100th podcast that I have done for you guys to really have that close connected relationship. Can you imagine? 100 episodes. I've been really honored and privileged to bring this show to you every week with wonderful advice and great topics of interest to help you in your relationship, and with amazing experts in the field of couples therapy and love and relationship counseling. What an awesome journey this has been. I am so excited to be able to celebrate this special milestone with all of you joining me here this day on this week in March. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for making room in your day and making time in your busy life to really listen to this podcast and give me your comments and suggestions for 100 episodes. There's nothing that gives me more joy than knowing that this podcast has made a difference to all of you. My hope is that these past 100 episodes is just a beginning, that our next 100 episodes will even be more special and more meaningful, and that we would all be able to have more dialogue about how to have a really authentic, special relationship for each and every one of you. This journey of mine is just starting. I am really excited for the next 100 episodes because my plan would be to bring on even more exciting guests and ones that are going to significantly make a difference in your world. With this 100th episode, I really want to thank you and acknowledge this milestone. You know, when a TV show hits 100 episodes, they usually have an incredible celebration with cake, champagne, and everything, because what they understand is that 100 really is a number in which they know the show's going to be around for a while. And as I see the numbers in our downloads increasing every month, and I see the comments and the suggestions that all of you are making, it warms my heart. I don't even know what words I can use to describe it, about how meaningful this little idea that I had to really bring to all of you a small little show. A show that maybe will have a guest here and there, but for the most part will be just me talking briefly about relationships. And if someone listens, that'd be good. The fact that we are now averaging over 6,000 downloads every single month just leaves me in awe. You know, my celebration is different than the TV's, because for me, I'm celebrating a milestone of what it really represents in my career. The number of wonderful people I've met during this show and the amount of people that I've been able to reach. I am so incredibly excited that you are here today to celebrate with me. One of the most fulfilling parts of doing this podcast is that we've been able to reach people internationally. We're in about 37 countries, and it's so incredibly satisfying to know that there is this common thread going around the world that understands that what love is about is not a guessing game. That we now know how to help people go from a feeling of disconnection to really understanding that your partner and you have each other's back, and that you're living this life with one significant person that you've happened to just run across. You know that it is by happenchance that your partner and you have gotten together. And with my guidance and with the guidance of this show, my hope is that you've been able to create something that will be around for the rest of your lives. I really want all of you thinking about milestones today, because that is really what I am acknowledging, that this 100th episode is a milestone in this podcast. You know, we celebrate anniversaries. The anniversary of when we met our partner, the anniversary of our first date, our engagement, our wedding day. And when we celebrate this, we come to terms with the fact that our life has meaning based on these milestones. And that the first time you looked your partner in the eye and said, "I love you," and the two of you did that together, both of you saying, "I love you" for the very first time. This milestone sits with you and you remember that. The memory of that really can take you to a place of such wonder and a wonderful feeling that you know you are not alone in this world. And that the goal that this podcast has had, and the fact that there are so many people out there that really say, we want what you want, Stuart. We want a love where every single person that we interact with feels connected to us and loved, and that we feel their love. You know, maybe you wanted to one day build a house together or buy a car. You know, grown-up stuff that you didn't know that could happen when you first met. And now that you've been together a bit, you believe not only in those things, but you allow yourself to dream about a future that's filled with a family, a love, a milestone that says celebrating our love together brings us the belief not only in ourselves, but in our partner. When I began to think about how I wanted to celebrate this milestone in this podcast, I went back and forth for a while. You know, what is the best way to celebrate it? Originally, what I was thinking is I'd say, this is the 100th episode. Maybe what we want to do is do 100 years of relationship history. But I quickly sort of put that away and said, nah, that's not really what I want to do. What I'd love to do is bring a guest on my show. So a guest, maybe someone who I've had on my show. So I decided what I would do is reach out to Robert Cox. I don't know how many of you listened to that episode. It was the 84th episode. And Robert Cox and I talked. We went back and forth for a while, and he agreed. And I was so excited. He was excited. And this is going to really show you a little bit about the transparency that I want to talk about of what happens with podcasting. Podcasting is an art of sending a message, but it's also an art of having to be flexible. And in almost every podcast, at least one or two things that happen that you don't expect, whether it's a feeling that comes up or a question that gets asked of you or you ask the question. But you really learn that winging it is about authenticity, about being yourself. And Robert Cox and I have been talking for the last few weeks, and all of a sudden, a couple of days ago, right before I was going to record this podcast, he came down with this incredible crisis and illness, which was a dental emergency. And he couldn't do it. And I found out about that just a couple of days ago. And initially, I sort of panicked because here's my 100th episode. I really want it to be special. I believe very much Robert Cox and I would have had an incredible episode. But he's sick. What can I do about it? What I did right away is thank my lucky stars that it was not me that had a dental emergency. If any of you have ever had one, there's nothing that's more painful. And I feel so bad for Robert Cox. I want to have all of us send out a shout out to him on his quick recovery. It's really awful. So Robert, hope you're feeling better and take care. And we look forward to having you come back in good shape. So what I had to do is begin to make a decision of what am I going to do now? because I really wanted someone to interview me because I really felt like there was more to sort of teach and talk about, and it'd be easier rather than me sort of sitting here talking on my own to have someone interview me. So I had this ingenious idea. My idea was I wanted to look for someone who really has been involved with the podcast, and wouldn't it be cool if I could find someone who was a listener? So I reached out to a woman that has been so very active with my podcast and always positive and making comments. And she lives in Southern Oregon in a town called Bonanza, Oregon. And right away I was thinking, oh, that's really cool. Bonanza. Maybe that was the same place that the Bonanza series was that I used to listen to as a kid. And they found out, no, that wasn't Bonanza, Oregon. That's Bonanza, Nevada. So Virginia is someone that really is a special lady. And when I reached out to her, it didn't take her long to say, absolutely, she'd come, she'd interview me, she'd take the risk and come on there. So it turns out that she is an equine professional and has worked in equine-assisted therapies, which is actually an area that I have a lot of interest in. She's very active in a horse rescue in Southern Oregon. So I want to learn a little bit about that from her. But more importantly, I want to just really thank her from the bottom of my heart for her willingness to really come on this show and ask me the questions that she would like to know about me, about my podcasting. So I'm going to let Virginia probably take over now, or I'll talk the whole podcast. I really am so happy that she's here. So Virginia, welcome to my podcast. Thank you for coming on at the last minute here, and thank you for helping me celebrate this milestone. So ready? Let's cue the balloons, blow out the candles, and here we go. The Couples Expert 100th episode with guest podcaster Virginia Curtis. Thank you, Virginia, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Stuart. I'm very excited to be here. I'm happy to celebrate with you and congratulate you on your 100th podcast episode.
Yeah, thank you very much. And, I mentioned in the opening that you do something with horse rescues. Tell me a little bit about what that is.
I do. As you know, I'm an avid horsewoman, and I've been working in equine-assisted psychotherapy for a few years as an equine specialist. And I'm also on the board of directors for the local horse rescue called Project Spirit Equine Rescue and Rehab. And I'm also the co-founder of an event called the Pegasus Project. And that's a trainer challenge where we give rescue horses to professional trainers for 90 days and then have an exhibition and an auction-style adoption where the horses are adopted into approved homes. And this cool. June will mark our third annual challenge.
I don't know if you're aware of, but one of the things that my wife and I do is we rescue Labrador retrievers, and it sounds sort of similar. You take the horse or the dog in and you find them a home.
Yes, it's a little harder with the large animals.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But yes, I'm very proud of the work that we do at Project Spirit. We don't only rescue horses. We actually help owners that get in trouble with other small livestock like goats or sheep or pigs. But horses are our main focus. And I'm on the board as the board secretary this year with Project Spirit.
Oh, that sounds really, really interesting. Anyway, I just really want to thank you for coming on. And, one of the things I will do, because you've been so gracious to do this, is in my show notes for this episode, I'll put a link to that organization for you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I appreciate that.
So what I would like today to be more than anything is for you to just sort of ask me whatever questions you think yourself or people who have been listening for these 100 weeks would be interested in knowing about the podcast. So I'm going to let you wing it. We talked a little bit about questions, but for the most part, I'd like these to be spontaneous because it really does make it much more real.
Okay. Yeah. I'd just like to know kind of how you got started as a podcaster, the medium of podcasts is rather new. And so you're sort of out there on the cutting edge of that. I don't know how many therapists are out there doing podcasts, but I'd like to hear a little bit of the history of how you got started.
Sure. When I decided to go and open my own office, one of the things that I was very aware of is that my training as a clinician did not really give me much support on how do I get my message out. So what I began to do is really, I got involved with Facebook, and I saw that there was a webinar on marketing a private practice. And a gentleman was the guest on the webinar. And one of the things that he talked about was podcasting. And when he began to talk about it, I got very excited, partly because my background many years ago was as an actor. And I used to do community theater, and I used to in high school and in college. And I actually went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City. At one point in my life, that was what I was hoping as a career. And the podcasting just seemed to fit for me. It seemed to fit because it would allow me to really get creative in terms of, my own sort of creativity in terms of the dramatic arts, doing a little bit shticks here and there. And then I began to really understand that, old-time radio, I guess not old-time radio, but the radio, and I always was someone that was very involved with audiovisual as in high school, and also in college. I worked behind the scenes, did the lighting for some of the shows, and that the fun of being artistic and also sending out a message really is special. And what I've come to learn more than anything, why this podcasting is such an integral need right now, is that there are so many people who may not necessarily need counseling, but they're sitting there at home just really feeling uncomfortable with what their love life is. And if they could just have some information, they would then know what to do, how they should approach their partner, and how do I really send the message. And as I went through my training as a clinician, and then later learning about emotionally focused therapy, which is the specialty that I do for couples. And what I've come to learn is it's no longer a guessing game with relationships. It used to be, if we cross our fingers and cross our toes, then everything would be okay. But what we learned as counselors is that what we were doing with folks wasn't really helping them. It was helping them short term. But long term, in terms of really permanent change, we didn't really know what to do. And the training now has gotten to a place where we know what to do. So what is so wonderful about podcasting is people get to feel me out. They get to really understand a bit on how I work, because every week they're listening. And they also are really understanding my message. And because of that, when people come to see me, and it's typically what I'm finding, is someone might listen to a podcast a year ago, and it may take them that long to come in, but when they do finally make that decision, when they come in, they already know me. So the trust level is already developed. So the counseling happens easier, and it's shorter because they've already got all that information. They know who I am. They trust me by then. So the work happens so much better. So podcasting, at least for counselors, is really, in my opinion, another service. And it's also my way of giving back to the community, because I've been very fortunate to have a practice that I started, which was quite small, and now has gotten to be one where a lot of people are coming and getting the help they need. Counseling sometimes can cost a lot of money. And this way I can give something back. I can offer a free service, my podcast, as a way of really helping our world have more connection.
That's great. And I've enjoyed listening to a lot of the topics and the guests that you've had on the podcast. It makes me curious, where do you source your topics and your themes from?
That is a great, great question. And it's sort of like sometimes I'm sitting there racking my brains and going, oh my gosh, what am I going to talk about next? And what I have found is as I've gotten more and more involved with social media, I've also been doing some writing, and I also love reading sort of and going to different places. And I began to sort of peruse the internet. And through my work in doing that and getting the information for me and my own training, I come across different sites. And when I do that, it's actually a way that I do both what I'm going to talk about as well as guests, because if I read something that I just find really meaningful, or the person has a style that seems really just up my alley, I might reach out to them. And now with the internet, and what's so wonderful about the internet is that you have a reach that now crosses country lines. So you and I sort of met, you living in Oregon, me in Scottsdale, Arizona, but I've also had people on my show who are from Australia or from France or from Great Britain. And I've developed these friendships through that. And more, that's where it happens. It happens just sort of casually. I'm sitting there, I'm either on Facebook and someone is making a comment and I'm liking the comment. And then rather quickly through Instant Messenger now on Facebook, I reach out and say, hey, do you have an interest? The other thing that I've done recently is I've posted an invite for people who want to be guests. So it really happens just like, you and I having a coffee somewhere and we just start talking and we might say, hey, you want to get together and, have a cup of coffee. It could end up where we really begin talking about things that are meaningful to both of us. And that's how the guesting tends to happen.
That's really neat. That's sort of an organic process then.
Yes. And what's so really, really cool for me, and it's such a powerful medium, I sort of stand back sometimes and go, oh my gosh, we sometimes have this image that people are cold or people are, they're only after themselves and they only want for themselves. But I've had now probably over 50 people who have been guests on my show. With 100 episodes, I would think it's about half and half, but it's probably in the beginning, it was almost all me. And then as I began to get more exposure, people reaching to me, and I'm meeting these people as I talked about. And now I would think it's maybe 2/3 guests and 1/3 for me. And every single one, there has not been one person that has asked for a dime. It's all been free. It's all been people who basically feel good about themselves, want to help others, want to give back to the community as I have. And it is such a wonderful sort of statement about our world. A lot of people have been sort of really concerned with the presidents here in the United States and what's happening with our country. And I actually have a very different attitude about it. As I see in social media, sometimes it's pretty awful what people are either saying or believing or how people have experienced some of these changes. It's almost this doom and gloom attitude, and I don't have any of it because I really believe that all of us are in this world together to make this world a better place. And so many people are giving back in order to do that. And my podcast is a perfect example of why I believe our future is really, really good.
And those messages really give you hope in humanity, don't they?
Yeah.
What I would like to ask you is for you to kind of look back, since this is such a milestone episode, your 100th podcast. What are some of your favorite past episodes of the Couples Expert Podcast? Do any kind of jump to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I think my number one favorite one has to be my child. I had my daughter Sarah on, and she was born with some developmental issues and some medical problems. And she was actually born, she was a preemie and was born at 37 weeks, was 4 pounds, 7 ounces, and had a disorder, a GI disorder called tracheoesophageal fistula, where her esophagus didn't grow the way it needed to. And actually, if we hadn't figured it out before she was born, she could have drowned in her own saliva because the saliva would have went into her lungs. But luckily, because of modern medicine and prenatal stuff, we figured this out, so we were all prepared. She's now 22, and she's in nursing school. And she very willingly, although it was sort of interesting trying to convince her, but she came on the show. And that episode for me was probably the most special. Number one, because I'll tell you right now, when she was first born, we were told some horrible things about her and about whether or not she'd ever eat, whether or not she'd ever be normal. And I recall situations like when she graduated, it's going to sound funny, but when she graduated elementary school, we never thought she'd live that long initially, because we were told she'd probably die when she was 5 initially. Now, they didn't have all the facts at the time, but seeing her graduate elementary school was talk about milestones. That was a milestone. Graduate high school, that was another milestone. So every time that I see her, and the fact that she's now an adult and I'm able to have these conversations with her, and the podcast was about how family love really can change and move mountains, and that because of that support, that's why she was able to make it through, because she's been, I think it's the number now is probably in the 20s or 30s surgeries that she's had to endure, because she periodically needs to do that. The funny story, and I'll move away from Sarah because I don't want to spend the whole time talking about that episode, but the funny story with Sarah is because her esophagus was so narrow, she, kids put stuff in their mouth, and we try to help them with that. But when she was a 2.5 or something, she literally swallowed 5 lead marbles. And, most people would go crazy and go, oh my God, something really horrible is going to happen to her. But they literally, because of the stricture of her esophagus and how narrow it was because of the problem, we have an x-ray that shows all 5 lined up in her esophagus, and you can see it on the x-ray. So there was nothing threatening because it never went below the top of her throat. It was pretty fascinating, actually.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah, so that episode, the other one, and because of, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, my episode of Martin Luther King Jr. was really a wonderful episode that I really found very meaningful. I've done some things like that before, but this year, I think more than other years, it really has been sort of, I don't know, maybe because of all the problems here in the States, that episode was really meaningful. And, re-listening to the I Have a Dream and doing my research for the Martin Luther King Jr. episode, that was a favorite. And I think one of the bigger favorites is because, again, it's about giving back, is I did a series a while back on infidelity, all different kinds, whether it's physical infidelity, sexual infidelity, financial infidelity. There's many, many different kinds of infidelities. And to be able to share with the audience tools and techniques about how to overcome infidelity, and that no longer do we have to say, once a cheater, always a cheater. That's been something that a lot of people have talked about. Can you ever trust again? And what we know now is that through the techniques that are part of emotionally focused therapy, we can bring couples back from that kind of despair into a feeling of trust and togetherness that your relationship will be secure, and that kind of trauma, that kind of injury would never happen again. So I think those are the favorite ones.
Those are some good ones. Okay, now I get to ask you a fun question. What was your most embarrassing on-air moment, or was there ever an episode that you recorded that when you listened back, you thought it was just a real stinker? One that you'd like to erase from the planet?
I don't think there's any that I want to erase from the planet. I think there are episodes, probably early ones, that I want to erase me from the podcast because of how uncomfortable I sounded from my standpoint. You know, we're our worst critic a lot of the time. And so for some of the episodes, it's sort of like I could do that better, I could do this better, I could do that better. So, but probably the most embarrassing, and it really, you know, as you begin to take any kind of venture upon yourself, you learn as you go. And the technology piece is always a challenge. You know, here we're dealing with Skype, or we're dealing with, you know, some other software. And I did this really incredible episode with a good friend of mine, actually, out of San Diego. And when I first started out, the length of the podcasts were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45 minutes to an hour. We've cut them back to about 30 minutes because I think people are on the go, and, you know, to ask people to listen for that long sometimes can be a challenge for folks. It was about an hour. And I went to play it, to review it after I hung up, and nothing was recorded. So this woman had taken all her time, canceled clients, I'm sure, to be on my show, and now I had to call her and say, whoops, and nothing, can you do it again? And we tried a couple of times and it didn't work. So ultimately we ended up just saying it wasn't going to happen. So that's probably the most embarrassing. The technology will always shoot you in the foot if you let it, which is why now I always do backups. And I've learned that I not only, you know, I use a recorder. I don't just have one source, because that way, if one thing falls apart, I've got the backup. So that's probably the most embarrassing.
Okay, well, that wasn't too bad because it never did get on the air.
No. I mean, there's some episodes where when you listen to, or when you're doing them, they sound exciting and they sound great. Then you play it back, they're not as, you know, exciting as others. You know, you always have a few of those kinds of things, but for the most part, everyone is just so willing and so freely giving of themselves. The fun is the interaction, and I love the guest ones much better than me sitting there trying to keep it interesting, just talking to, you know, the air.
Yeah, you have a lot of really good guests on the podcast. You have one kind of big name that sort of stands out in your history, and it's a doctor that you use a lot of her techniques in your practice as well, and that's Dr. Sue Johnson.
Yeah, yes.
How did you come to get her on your show?
You know, that's a real interesting one, because I had wanted to have her on the show for quite some time. And when I first started out, I was like, why would she even consider it, kind of thing? Who am I? But, you know, as I got more and more comfortable with the microphone and more comfortable interviewing, I began to get a little bit bolder. And I actually went on LinkedIn and looked her up and sent out an invite, and I never heard. And then gradually, as I began to have more and more guests, that was like, 2-3 years ago, gradually I had more and more guests, and I had someone on the show that was also part of the EFT community. And she said to me, she loves doing this kind of stuff. And she happened to have an email to her assistant. So I emailed the assistant. Within 45 minutes of sending that email, I got an email back saying she'd love to be on it. And, the chills and excitement start, and then the trepidation and fear of, oh my gosh, I'm going to have Sue Johnson on the show. I better look good and I better do well. So I began to communicate both with her and with her assistant, and she was just so gracious, and she was exactly what I really thought she would be, which is someone that really cares. You know, you never know when you hear these names and meet these people whether they really are as genuine as you think they are. And she really turned out to be someone special. So I really appreciate, if she's listening, thank you, Dr. You know, she doesn't like doctor, so I want to do it the way she asked. And that was sort of a talk about embarrassing. That may be one of the things. I had her on the show, and I kept calling her Dr. Johnson, a formal kind of, you know, I thought that would, and she'd say, no, call me Sue. And then I'd be talking, and then I'd call her Dr. Johnson again. And she said, no, call me Sue. And, you know, so I did that a few times. That's probably, you know, one of the more embarrassing pieces is, you know, I wanted her to be comfortable, and I just couldn't bring myself to calling her Sue. But Sue really is a wonderful individual, and thank you, Sue, for being on the show.
Well, I know our time's getting short, and I have just a couple more quick questions for you. Mm-hmm. I'd really like to know what motivates you, what drives you to do this every week. You're a busy guy. You've got your office practice. You've got all of your marketing endeavors and everything that you do, speaking engagements, et cetera. What gets you out of bed every morning?
I think the change that I see in my office every single day, and my belief, and I think part of that is, as I said earlier, I was brought up in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, and have always been in social active kinds of organizations. And I really have been horrified over the last decade of the death, of unnecessary death, whether it's substance abuse. I'm actually just going to be doing an episode, actually next week's episode, which is going to be on prescription abuse, drug addiction. And I actually did a video today, I actually recorded it, where I went out to a local cemetery. And I did that on purpose. I wanted something that might scare people, because that really is what happens. People die from those types of things. And with recently the school shootings, people getting killed and people bringing guns into movie theaters and shooting up a movie theater, or people who are prejudiced, who are killing people because of the color of their skin or the way that they love. Those things horrify me. And I really believe if I can really help people, because what we know when we look at those things, when we look at people who go into a movie theater and kill lots of people, they're usually outsiders. And they're usually people that when you begin to do sort of this autopsy on who they were, and I don't mean medical autopsy, but an autopsy and saying, why did they do what they did? More often what we have learned, the reason is they felt estranged from people. And if I can help you and your partner feel connected to one another, and by osmosis or by just your child being in the home, seeing that kind of love and that kind of connection and them feeling connected to you, they're going to want that, and they're going to have a life and a marriage and a relationship, and then their children and their children's children. And we're not going to have people that feel like outsiders, and where our world will be in a better place. And as I turn 62 this year, my desire and my motivation to get out of bed is to change the world to where we all feel connected to one another, and love is what moves people.
Well, and I think you're doing that one couple and one podcast and one blog at a time. I really appreciate that about you.
You know, we're close to running out of time. I try to keep it under a certain amount of time. So I'd like you to ask one or two more questions, and then I'd like to say goodbye to everyone, if that's okay, because you've done such a wonderful job in asking these questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'd like to know from a listener point of view, what do you have coming up that listeners can look forward to on the next 100 episodes?
You know, one of the things that we're doing a bit different over the next 100, and we've started that just recently, is my podcasts tend to be theme-based now. So I come up with a topic. For instance, I mentioned the topic that we're doing next week is on prescription addiction. And then everything that I do is around that theme. My YouTube videos, and I'm going to be doing something different with those coming up. I actually have a new kind of service that's about to be unfolded, although we don't have the details yet, which is going to be Stuart's Daily Notes, where I'm going to be offering a subscription service for people. It's free, where people can get a morning video from me to talk about their day and how to do that. So what I'm constantly looking for are new and interesting ways to really help people see what it takes to really feel loved. So, some of the things we have coming up, one of the topics that I keep hearing a lot about, I'm actually going to be doing a recording on that either today or next week some point, is this whole issue of online dating, online relationships, and is online really a safe and good place to meet someone? Truth is, my wife and I met online. So I have a personal interest in that. So we'll be talking about some of the online dating. We'll be talking about online counseling and whether that's a good way of receiving those services. I'm going to be doing a lot more on sexuality, eroticism in particular, because, the belief used to be that if you have a good relationship emotionally outside the bedroom basically takes care of itself. But what we're learning is, yes, you may have an active sex life, but it doesn't necessarily have you feeling turned on by your partner, and couples need to learn how to talk about that. So we're going to be talking about that. Long distance relationships is another topic that is really hot right now. And we're not talking about people who are dating. We're talking about people who are married, who one works in Europe, the other works here in the States. How do they maintain a closeness with that? Does someone have to quit their job so we're going to be talking about those kinds of things. So, I'm constantly looking for things that are really interesting. And one of the pleads that I have for my listeners, like yourself, is to please comment on the things that we do. I understand it's tough to do that, especially with the topics, because, people want to keep their lives private. But the more I know about topics that people want to hear, that's how I reach out and find guests. So I urge everyone to just please comment. If you want to do it anonymously, you can send me an email at stuart@thecouplesexperts.com or on my website, which is www.thecouplesexperts, that's plural, experts.com. You can always, through my contact page, send me a suggestion. So I really just want to thank everyone for listening, for being part of this milestone and helping me celebrate this today, and especially you, Virginia.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad I was able to help out. All
right. So I look forward to all of you. I look forward to our next 100th episode or 100 episodes. And I really wish you all a good night, a good day. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for allowing me to be someone that you bring into your love life, and you bring me in an open heart, in allowing me to really share what I love, which is helping you guys have that really special relationship that'll last a lifetime. Take care and stay connected. Bye-bye.